Hello, this is Dr. Ian McCullough of Johns Hopkins University. This is a short lecture on social network analysis, social theory. There are three learning objectives for this lecture. The first is to describe and distinguish between social forces. Social forces are the things that compel two people to interact in some form of relationship. Understand the hierarchy of social link formation. So as groups form and evolve, what is the order or hierarchy in which these social forces interact to create and define and develop social groups? And familiarity with basic social theories and social network analysis. You'll find that a lot of these lecture slides are simply pointers to papers in the field of sociology, and those papers are provided for further exploration. The first theory is the identity theory, and this was proposed by Cooley in 1902, and he called it the looking glass self. He basically stated that people are going to consider how other people perceive them, they imagine how those people judge that appearance, and then they develop their sense of self-identity through the perceived judgment of others. So a lot of that perception of how others are going to judge them depends upon the social norms and mores of the group in the context in which you are interacting. Erickson went on to expand on this a number of years later to say that self-worth and identity are at the core of human development through all stages of the human development process. And then Rogers went on to state that people need social groups to validate their identity. So one of the reasons why we interact socially with others is because it validates our sense of who we are and our identity. Moving to a different theory, we would ask, why don't people have hundreds and hundreds of friends and connections then in order to better validate their sense of identity? Well, there are certain constraints on the number of relationships that a person can have. So Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist in 2010, identified that the size of the cerebral cortex was correlated with the number of social connections a primate could maintain. So he found that with primate communities such as chimpanzees and other primates, the size of their communities was highly related to the size of the surface area of the cerebral cortex. So Dunbar then estimated that the number of human connections a person can have is about 150, and we find that in many military organizations, in many other organizations, 150 is in fact a very reasonable constraint on the size of a network. In fact, it is such an important number that I argue that it's the difference between a medium-sized network and a large network. A large network occurs at 150 because beyond that number it's no longer possible for agents in the network to know everybody. They don't know who do they need to coordinate with to get access to a resource or a piece of information. Kilworth and Bernard had done other studies mainly focused at informant accuracy. How accurate are people at filling out social network surveys? When people have gone back and retroactively analyzed the data they collected, they had a slightly different estimate of the size or the constraints on the number of connections you can have. They said a person can have about 231 connections on average, with a maximum in their studies of 290. Mayhew and Levenger, though, before either of these, oddly enough, stated that the number of connections a person had might be dependent upon three factors. One was the nature of the relationship. So is it a face-to-face? Is it an acquaintance? What's the level of investment required in terms of time and possibly resources? And the third thing is, what is the cognitive limitations on the actual person themselves? This body of research is not fully developed and basically states that you can't be connected to everybody, that there is at least some number that constrains the number of connections that you have. Well, the constraint has an interesting effect. it means that people are going to maximize the utility in their network. Now, the objective functions that they may use for that utility might vary. It might be somebody wants to have quite a few low-value ties, or maybe they want to concentrate on a few high-value ties. Some decide to diversify across social groups. Instead of being fully invested in one organization that they're highly committed to, they might have membership in multiple social groups. Resource heterophily basically refers to they want to have connections to people with different resources that they can draw on. Other people, however, are going to reinforce their sense of identity by affiliating with similar people. Love, friendship, security, belonging is another form of a reason why people are going to join groups and make relationships. Some do so for employment, for hobbies, for activities. All of them vary, and it's not necessarily to say that people have only one objective function. There might be multiple objective functions that kind of create an overall sense of desirability that's unique to that individual. But given that we are focused on maximizing utility, people don't form connections at random because we don't have the ability to just randomly form relationships. We are going to focus on some social object or focus, and that focus creates a social circle. And a person might belong to a social circle, or they might belong to many social circles. And these objects basically create clustering around certain objects of social significance. Moving gears, we'll talk about social exchange theory. So this is where people are having social interactions based on some sort of cost-benefit analysis that they have calculated. There's a few things about social exchange that we've learned. One is reciprocity compels social exchange. If I give something of value to you, you are likely to respond reciprocally by giving something of value to me. If I engage in a social interaction or friendship with you, then you're more likely to engage with me. People enter into social exchange motivated by a perceived exchange of benefits. There's some sort of quid pro quo, even if that is just acceptance and social reinforcement. Social exchange is highly linked to power, dependence, and cohesion. So certain positions that people have in a network will affect the power that they can have. So in an example like the two-node network here, we see reciprocity. In the three-node network, node D occupies a position of power because if E and C want to exchange resources or knowledge, they must go through D, which gives D a position of power. In the case of a four-node network such as this, we'll find that because I and F do not have the ability to exchange except through H and G may exchange with each other at a greater degree and exploit the profits or the benefits in the network, leaving I and F disproportionately less well off. So the position in the network allows an unequal distribution of benefits. Thus, who you know and who you're connected to matter. We're now going to talk about social forces. The first social force we're going to discuss is homophily. Homophily is a term that talks about similarity among agents. Now, the specific attributes for calculating homophily is not defined. And it is also not necessarily some fixed set of attributes, and if people are similar, they're for sure going to talk. It's more of a perceived similarity. There's a story I like to tell of my first time on faculty at West Point. This is where you'll have about 20 officers are going to show up at their first duty station knowing nobody, and the network begins to evolve. So there were two individuals that I thought were similar to me. We had similar family, religious beliefs, military experience, and so I wanted to be their friends. Well, I was sad to find a few months into my tour there at West Point that They were getting together for barbecues and tailgates, and I was not invited. So they were friends with each other, but I was left out. So a year later, another gentleman joined the faculty, and he and I quickly became best friends. He's one of my co-authors on my book. And he was also invited to the barbecues with these other two individuals. Well, what I'm not telling you is these other three individuals were all African American. And so for the two people that I was interacting with at first, being African American was a vital part of their identity, and because I was not African American, I did not seem similar from their perspective. Well, the new gentleman that joined the department, he was also African American, but being African American was not a vital part of his identity. Therefore, he felt that he was more similar to me based on our religious values, our family size and situation, etc., and therefore he chose to hang out with me more than the other two gentlemen. I'm not saying that there was any issue of racism going on here, but the perceptions of similarity are going to affect this social force of who we are drawn to initially. Homophily is also dynamic, so the more you interact with people, the more you associate with them, the more you're going to discover similarities or determine that what I thought was similar is really not similar at all. So association leads to a better understanding of homophily amongst the actors you're with, but association also leads to conformity, where people are going to tend to conform to the values that the group holds dear. So I also like to use this example of forming, norming, storming. I did a series of studies of networks at West Point over a period of 6 years, where we took about 25 faculty or staff members that would join a one-year master's program run by Columbia University at West Point and see how those networks would evolve over time. We would find that for the first 5 weeks, very visible outward attributes tended to drive homophily, like military branch, whether you're a West Point graduate or not, race, were all things that drove those initial 5 weeks. Beyond that, however, religion actually was the most significant variable. And I don't think there was some sectarian issue, but if you're at work and then you go to church and you don't know anybody at church, but you see a guy you work with, you're more likely to interact. Then you go back to work, and there's a guy that you go to church with, you're more likely to interact. So I think that the fact that West Point had a Protestant chapel and a Catholic chapel created more opportunity for people to see each other, and that proximity, that recognition, is what drove the perceived homophily and developing those social ties. Reciprocity is another social force. We'll call this social force number 2. It's the I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Bottom line is it creates a lower cost for establishing a link. If I come and start engaging with you socially and talking to you, it's easier for you to talk to me than going to somebody you haven't met yet and starting a relationship with them. Negative relationships are also at play in this social force. So if you treat somebody negatively, they're going to have negative feelings towards you. The third social force is proximity. Now, proximity can be physical or organizational. So you can be close to somebody in the same office or the neighboring office, or you might be in totally different offices but the same organization. You're still going to be on the same organizational distro lists, on email. You're going to have organizational gatherings. There are multiple ways of calculating distance. What I'm showing you in the images here is multiple ways of calculating distance in an office space. So I did a paper in the Journal of Social Networks a number of years ago, and we basically took different organizations and we created line segments to represent the field of view of whether or not you could see other actors in your organization. These line segments of the physical space can be represented as proximity networks, and we can then evaluate different ways of measuring those proximity networks and their impact on social interaction and collaboration within the networks. We find that in open office plans, actually seeing somebody or having a radial distance of how far you have to turn your head to see somebody is more indicative of a relationship than the actual number of steps it takes or the metric distance it takes to get from one node to the other. The next social force we're discussing is prestige. Prestige is how important a person is within the context of the culture or the group you're talking about. It is culturally dependent. So it's also somebody who epitomizes those cultural norms. So in the military, somebody that's an airborne ranger is somebody that's gone to certain training or certain skills or demonstrated a certain level of rigor and is respected. In a high school, it might be the star athlete. A celebrity, it might be somebody that's got high education like a doctor. It really depends upon the culture that you're operating in. Prestige can be lost, and people don't want that. If that airborne ranger entered the organization and was militarily incompetent, couldn't read a map, couldn't read anything that's didn't know how to do patrolling, didn't understand what type of weapon system they were using, he would quickly lose respect, and people would not value him as a proficient military soldier. Similarly, if the star athlete drops the pass and can't catch the ball anymore or doesn't run very fast anymore, he can lose his prestige. People don't want that. Prestige also can depend upon associations. So if you are associating with other prestigious people, people are going to assume that you are also prestigious and value and epitomize those cultural norms. I often use this second to last bullet to drive discussion in class with the idea that, hey, men have a greater desire for prestige. Ask what you think about that. Does that offend you? Does that bother you that I say that? What do I mean by that? I don't think it's true. I think I bring it up because men and women may place different values on what is prestigious or not. And it's not so much a man-woman thing as the cultures in which we operate. Most societies tend to have a male or female culture, and those create different norms as far as what is considered prestigious. One of my favorite studies was done by Dan Haljan. He's a professor at University of Kentucky, on his rapper disc network. And what that means is he studied a bunch of rap songs, and if one rapper disrespected another rapper in a music song, that's called a diss or disrespect. So he mapped out these networks and found out that the interactions amongst these things are very complex and counterintuitive. If you are a person that disrespects another rapper, your prestige goes up, their prestige goes down under normal circumstances. If you fail to respond, you remain low prestige. If you respond, however, your prestige goes up, and the collective increase of the two of you for disrespecting each other has risen. If, however, you are a big rapper and you're disrespected by a little rapper, your respect level does not go down. It actually increases maybe a little bit. If, however, you acknowledge and respond to the little rapper, his prestige skyrockets and yours actually goes down a little bit. So there are very complex interactions in how people respond and exchange in these kinds of networks. He measured prestige, by the way, as the total volume of record sales, which continue to go up and interact in this network activity over time until Tupac and Biggie were shot, in which case disrespecting in rap songs went to nothing for a period of time, and then it's since become one of the best ways to increase your record sales in the rap industry. We're now going to move to a slightly different topic, social conformity. Solomon Asch did some very interesting studies. I would encourage you to search YouTube for a video of Solomon Asch to see one of his studies. We may put one on the course website for viewing. He basically determined that implicit group pressures are going to influence opinion. So he found in a series of studies that 37% of people conform to group opinion. And of the 37%, 1/3 have what they call informational conformity. They think that whatever they are interpreting and seeing in the facts is wrong and everybody else must be right. 2/3 of the people that conform do it for normative conformity. They just don't want to be different. So what he did is he set up a set of studies where he would have, a number of people in a room, and they would look at the lengths of lines and report on, okay, hey, is this line the length of 1, 2, or 3? And then he would have one person is the subject, the others are confederates of the experiment, and so the subject thinks that they're participating in this larger group study of perception. But in reality, the confederates are going to respond incorrectly to a certain number of trials and see how does that subject respond to that social pressure. He found that if there was one single dissenter in the confederates, the conformity dropped from 37% to 5%, although the people denied the fact that anybody else had anything to do with their conformity. I did a study on network conformity where I took social groups where we had social network data on them and put them through a slight variation of this, but to see if their position in the network affected their conformity. And we found that with negative 0.84 correlation between the centrality and their conformity on the number of questions they conform to with high significance. What this means is if you are central to the network, you do not have the pressure to conform, but through prestige, you're likely to epitomize the norms anyway. If you are on the periphery of the network, your desire for social acceptance is going to drive you to conform at a much greater likelihood. I also did studies of military units, an infantry brigade that was deploying to a combat tour in Afghanistan. We did psychometric scales before their deployment, 3 months into their deployment, and post-deployment, and found that social acceptance was perhaps the most significant factor in the onset of PTSD, depression, and the likelihood for suicide. In a related study, Milgram conducted a series of experiments. There's a movie out on some of his work. He found that 65% of people were willing to commit immoral acts if an authority figure absolved them of responsibility. So prestige and centrality increase opinion leadership and are metrics we can use to measure the likelihood that an actor has the ability to influence a social group. The next social force we're going to discuss is transitivity. This is simply the idea that two people might be introduced or connected by a third party. There's a mathematical definition, which is if you multiply a network, an adjacency matrix by itself, and get the original adjacency matrix, that is transitive. We find that if you model or simulate networks based on this principle, you find a cohesive cluster and a bunch of isolate nodes, and it doesn't simulate well. So a modification of that is the geometrically weighted edgewise shared partner, which basically says there's a diminishing marginal return to the additional connections. So in other words, if two people have one friend in common, they're more likely to meet. If they have two friends in common, they're even more likely to meet. But if they have 30 friends in common and they haven't met yet, there's probably a good reason for it. So there is a diminishing marginal value for each additional shared partner. There are 16 potential triads, and this is oftentimes used when we discuss transitivity. So the charts show the numbers of the different triads, and they each have a variety of how many null ties, meaning no tie between two actors, how many mutual ties, how many asymmetric ties exist between actors. We're going to discuss our last social force, which is balance. I'm going to use an illustrative example. The definition of balance is essentially a friend of my friend is my friend, a friend of my enemy is my enemy, and an enemy of my enemy is my friend. In this particular example, I'm going to use Afghanistan. In this particular case, the U.S. and the Taliban both have a positive relation with the Afghan population. But the U.S. and the Taliban do not have a positive relationship with each other. So this creates a cognitive dissonance where it is hard for an Afghanistan person to reconcile their affinity to the Taliban or their affinity to the U.S. when they are not getting along. It creates cognitive dissonance. But the Afghan is not just the Afghan. they might be two tribes, in this case Pashtun and Hazar. They don't like each other either. So now, when the U.S. attempts to create a positive relationship with the Pashtun, what happens to its relationship with the Hazar? Well, the Hazar says a friend of my enemy is my enemy, and that is likely to emerge as a negative tie. Well, what does that do with the Taliban's ability to interact with the Hazar? Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so on. So how do we create stability in this network if it is unstable and unbalanced? Well, the trick is to focus on a target relationship that's going to enable stability, and if that becomes positive, now this consolidated group can either become positively tied to the U.S. or the Taliban in this example. If balance were the only social force, you would see the network bifurcate into two distinct groups, but other factors, other social forces keep tension in the network. And these are important to reason about different key leader engagements, or different, in the military we would call it non-lethal targeting. So we've discussed structural balance, and this is the term, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And balance essentially shows the tension in the network. So here we see a dyad. We see here an open triad, in which case the structural balance gives us an ability to reason about how a link might be formed. And in a closed triad, it gives us an idea of how stable those relationships will remain. We've discussed transitivity. Transitivity and structural balance are related and very similar, so we oftentimes do not include both terms when we're using it in a statistical model. Again, if P and O's relationship was negative, but P and X's relationship was positive, over time X will develop a negative attitude towards O. That is essentially what structural balance is telling us. Here's a chart that shows the different relationships between 1 and 2, 1 and 3, and 2 and 3 in a network. And it identifies what is a balanced relationship and what is an imbalanced relationship, where a positive indicates positive or liking, negative indicates a negative relationship or dislike. Here is another view of balanced and unbalanced triads, where in this case the dashed line represents a negative relationship and a solid line represents a positive relationship. We can look at networks and say, are the networks balanced or unbalanced? It is balanced if it essentially bifurcates into two groups. Clusterability is a term related to balance, and it basically determines whether or not we can break the network into two teams. So in this network, you will see that there is positive ties up here, meaning all of these actors like each other and dislike all of the other actors. And the second group likes each other and dislikes all of the first group. So that is a clusterable network that can be broken into two teams. A network is either clusterable or it's not. So one node reaching across the aisle, so to speak, would mean the network is no longer clusterable. We're moving on to actor optimization strategies. Ron Burt proposed a concept called structural holes. Structural holes basically said that it occurs when there is one sole broker between social objects or clusters in a network. This person will have high informal power, but also finds that that is a cognitive demanding role. If you remember Conrad from our previous network with Dave Crackhart, Conrad was the sole broker between two clusters. In the actual organization, he eventually quit, being sick of being the only go-between between the two clusters in the network. So it is cognitively demanding. Other actors in the network will naturally seek to develop redundant ties, and if a person wants to remain the middle of a structural hole, then they have to expend effort to prevent tie formations, and this can inhibit the growth and health of the network from a collaboration perspective. But it is an effective strategy if that actor wants to maintain power in the network. Social capital we touched on briefly. This is the ability for an actor to connect to others' knowledge and resources, and it's usually through informal interaction. And this is what really facilitates collaboration in agile networks. But social capital is not free. It costs time, social expectation. If you are going to leverage a resource, people are going to expect things in return. It may also require resources. If you want to increase collaboration in your organization, you have to invest and allow people the time to develop those social relationships. We're now going to pull all of this together and discuss link optimization. I'm going to give you an example. Steve is a friend of mine since 1994. We were lieutenants in the Army together. I haven't seen him in a long time. Nancy is my grandkid's nanny. Lives in Florida. See her every day. My wife, we've been married for almost 20 years. Also lives in Florida. See her every day. We can describe this on a quadrant proposed by Matt Brashears as a level of frequency and intimacy in the relationship. So an old friend is up here in quadrant 2, somebody I don't see very often but had a good level of intimacy with. A spouse would be in quadrant 1, see them frequently and have close relationship with them. A coworker might be in quadrant 4 down here, where frequent interaction but not more of a casual relationship. And a stranger would be down here in quadrant 3. The value of a tie then depends upon these two factors, the strength of a tie. So if all of a sudden I needed some sort of social support and there was a, like a death of a loved one, who would you go to? Well, you may not be as willing to go to a coworker as an old friend. Obviously, the spouse would be somebody that would have both. So social media often allows us to cache these old friends and gain access to them for greater use, and that's one potential explanation for the value people place in social media. Not the only one, but a value. So the hierarchy of social link motivation basically goes through these 4 stages of affiliation. This affiliation is where we initially form weak social ties and loose affiliations with an organization. The motivation is identity reinforcement, status, maybe prestige, or maybe some other kind of value for, like, we want to look for a job or find somebody to enjoy a hobby with us. As we then establish social links in forming, we validate those relationships, the resources we're gaining from this group, and the motivation becomes homophily, reciprocity, and proximity. We then move to a conforming stage where we establish social norms, social conformity, group acceptance, and our motivation is prestige, influence, and power. We finally move to the optimization stage where we're maximizing our utility, we're minimizing our effort in those social relationships, and our motivations now are more complex social phenomena such as transitivity, structural holes, social capital, link optimization, balance, and clusterability. You'll see that these are docked next to the forming, storming, norming, performing you may have heard of in small group development. So people need to affiliate before they go to the forming stage. Conforming is equivalent to storming. Optimization is the norming and performing. Understanding where a group is in development provides insight into what motivations are driving link formation and gives you different targeting strategies and interventions on how you may shape the collaboration and the group development. In summary, here are the 6 social factors, social forces affecting actor relations. Pause and take a minute to make sure you understand these 6 social forces. Here are other key social theories we have discussed in this lecture. Here is the reading list of additional readings. It is extensive. I would ask that you pause on each page if you wish to write them down or review the reading list. This was a short lecture on social network analysis, social theory. This is Dr. Ian McCullough of Johns Hopkins University.